All right, it's another great episode of the Locked On Nets podcast. But Doug, first, hit us with the beats.
Oh my gosh, what a weekend in Nets land. It's going to take us a couple of podcasts to break it down. In this first one, we're going to roll through the DeAndre Jordan trade, what it means for the team, what the team got back in return, getting it going here on YouTube as well. So we got it all, we're going to cover it all here.
It is a jam-packed one, as it always is for us. But first, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets. It's every single day. I'm Adam Armbrecht, covering, of course, the Nets and also the New York Football Giants over on the One Giant podcast, joined as always by Doug Norrie, your DFS expert. If you're in the daily fantasy space, Doug Norrie's the man, the myth, the legend for you on all those fronts. NBA, NFL, of course, coming up just around the corner, and MLB in full swing right now. Doug, as you said at the top, we're launching officially on YouTube as well, so people can see our big, beautiful faces and confirm or deny some of those advances we make in our closing comments around good-looking guys. We say that a lot, but now people can know that for sure.
Well, now people are just going to get a chance to see that I never change my outfit on a day-to-day basis, because it's going to be hard to tell when you look through the video, when you look through the YouTube rolls, when we get to the end of the season. It's going to look like we just did one consecutive podcast the entire time, because I wear like two outfits and I just rotate them back and forth. And that doesn't necessarily happen one day to the next day. It could be multiple days with one, and then we kind of retire it for a few and get back. But yeah, no, so that we'll get excited to get going on YouTube. We'll have the link for the YouTube channel in the notes here for the podcast. Big weekend, buddy. Oh my goodness. This is going to take two parts. Just we mentioned at the beginning, this is going to take definitely two podcast episodes to even begin to scratch the surface of what the Nets pulled off over the weekend.
Yeah, unlike the Lakers, we think about the big rivalry in the league as far as who's going to be there in the championship at the end of the season, as many suspect. Lakers made a bunch of their moves early, quote unquote. The Nets just kind of waited it out. And then after the draft, some time pays off and they go ahead and make a series of moves, starting with the biggest of which that allowed the other dominoes to fall, I think, is the DeAndre Jordan buyout and finally being able to move on from him, as was speculated. Walk us through the details of it and how it opened up the opportunity for the Nets to make bigger moves in this offseason.
Yeah, this is a huge thing. So we talked about this a little bit last week, I'm taking a massive L on DeAndre Jordan, of how I thought he was going to factor into the team this year. That's no doubt about it. I was making so many cases for why I thought there was going to be a place for him, and maybe I was just trying to talk myself into it or whatever the deal was. But there's just that one didn't age well about where DeAndre Jordan was going to end up fitting in. So we kind of knew that the Nets needed to, once it was speculated that they were trying to move off him, we knew they were trying to trade him. I really didn't think there'd be a suitor, just because of the money and the years and how little value he had at this point, yada, yada, yada. But in the end, they are able to move They send DeAndre Jordan and like 1 million second-round picks to they send DeAndre Jordan 4 second-round picks and $6 million in cash considerations. That is just to get off the contract. Like, this is how, again, when we talk about sort of like a negative asset, where DeAndre Jordan was, at least in terms of the rest of the league, and I guess how the Nets viewed him as well, this to give up this many sort of assets and money just to get off the contract, it really tells you a lot about how kind of everyone's viewing it. They do get back Jahlil Okafor, Sika Doumbouya, and the big news here is that they are able to slash $47 million off their tax too, and not really open a roster spot, because they got 2 guys back, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But those are the bones of the deal. When you read that, and sort of like what they gave up, what they got back, what were your initial thoughts? Because it's such a crazy place to be in here with DeAndre Jordan, considering we're 2 years removed from him being, I mean, it was probably the wrong title to give it, but that was the original big 3 that come over to sign to sign with the Nets. What were your thoughts when you saw sort of how this deal ended up going down?
Yeah, well, big picture takeaway is that for everything that you had to put into that package to move off of DeAndre Jordan, remember it's at the $10 million number this year and then next year as well. The thing that I take away is it's so interesting how a player's value is looked at, because it hasn't occurred yet, but all the rumors and speculation is that DeAndre Jordan's going to eventually sign with the LA Lakers, a team that's trying to win a championship and they're saying DeAndre Jordan is a guy that can come in and contribute to our championship aspirations. The Nets are piling in picks and throwing money at a team to move off of them. So it's this weird world where if DeAndre was making $5 million this season, maybe the Nets wouldn't have automatically moved off of him, right? So it's interesting that this isn't necessarily so much maybe to say, I know you said, take the L on the take around DeAndre Jordan, but I don't think it's still not necessarily the worst take in the world if you just remove the money piece of it. I think the Nets would look at him differently. They'd look at him like a Millsap or other players that they're targeting to build out around this roster. It's just about the dollars and cents of this, and that's what facilitated this whole move. It's why the Nets were trying to dump him into packages over the course of the offseason.
Yeah, right. And they didn't want the dead cap money from having to buy him out. They obviously weren't interested in doing that. Because the Detroit sort of has tons of dead cap now. They've been just sort of building their whole team on just taking other people's taking contracts and just cutting the guys. Their dead cap numbers are nuts. I mean, Blake Griffin's alone, but that's just kind of what they've been doing as part of their sort of retooling. So it did make sense from a suitor. I think you're totally correct about how sort of one man's trash is another man's treasure, but the dollar amounts that are associated with are much different for the Lakers than they were for the Nets. And the Nets just couldn't say, hey, about that 20 million we owe you, how about we make it a veteran minimum, right? And so there wasn't going to be like they could do something like that. So they didn't have the mechanism by which they were going to be able to do the thing the Lakers are going to do. So from that standpoint, it makes total sense. And not for nothing, I know people love to just spend Joe Tsai's money willy-nilly without it. The $47 million on the cap that's not immaterial, right? That's a huge number to not be over that hard cap tax threshold. So it's just a really interesting thing. I looked at it as a win, frankly.
Well, you were able to do it without outright just having to buy him out, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the other piece. Again, we always talk about these moves, and sometimes, to your point, Joseph Tsai should just spend more money, or the Nets should just do this or just do that. But Sean Marks continually has found a way, whether the outside perception is, did you do it as quickly as you could have, in order to facilitate another move? He always finds a way to generate value out of these moves. And this is another example of it, especially when you look inside the players that they brought back. And to your point, I don't know why we illustrate this. $47 million is a lot. I don't care how rich you are. It's still a significant amount of money. And it means also that the Nets can afford to do things down the road that may end up dipping back into that threshold and, bringing that number back up again at some point. But you do have to keep bailing out some of the water in the boat, even if it just means you're going to take on more later.
Oh, yeah, totally. And so it was obviously this is what they wanted to do. This, again, in terms of timeline, this is not the first thing that happened over the weekend. We're going to go back and talk about Millsap. We're going to go back and talk about LaMarcus Aldridge. All that stuff is important for sort of what we want to break down here. So we're not just skipping over this piece, but the DJ piece was so big because in some ways it allowed those other things to happen, and it allows the Nets to, they're not getting younger here because Jahlil Okafor is almost definitely getting cut. They haven't said that yet, but I can't envision a world where he's on the team next year. So I think he's gonna he's out. Demboya is an interesting one. We'll talk about him shortly, about if there's going to be a landing spot. Maybe by the time you hear this podcast, they've already just figured out what they're doing here, because the Nets have been making crazy moves just in short periods of time. So there's some chance that this is all sorted itself out, because right now they basically have, if they were to sign they have too many players. And Alize Johnson looks like he's on his way out too. So we're going to get to all this in a second. I want to just kind of recap some of DJ's time here in Brooklyn, because it's super interesting. Just about how he came originally, and sort of the narratives, how much the narrative has changed around him in a really, really short period of time. It's kind of fascinating. It wasn't too long ago that we were having heated debates around DeAndre Jordan. First, got to talk to you about our friends over at Sweat Block. If you had problems sweating, it can be embarrassing. You got to switch shirts when you don't want to. You're worried about standing up in front of people. You're worried about if the shirt's going to show more sweat than others. I've dealt with this stuff. I know what it's like. I know what it's like to stand up in front of people and be literally sweating it out about whether the sweat is going to show through the shirts or not. You don't have to worry about it anymore when you get rolling with Sweat Block. You wear what you want to wear. You have more confidence. It's a must-have for everyone if you've been dealing with this problem, or if you know someone you love that's been dealing with it. Go over and get the Sweat Block Antiperspirant wipes. They're clinical. All you have to do is apply them at night before you go to bed. The next morning you wake up, you wash, you go about your day. You're not worried about sweat. Guaranteed. Sounds too good to be true. I've used this stuff. It works. Just once or twice a week, you're staying dry the whole time. Like I said, you're not picking out shirts anymore based on which one's going to hide the sweat better. If you or someone you love is dealing with it, check out Sweat Block now. You can get 20% off at sweatblock.com. You have to use the promo code Locked On, or you head on over to Amazon or CVS. They have it there too. But you want to put a little wind in our sails, head to sweatblock.com, 20% off, promo code Locked On, sweatblock.com.
You may not know this, but 85% of people who play daily fantasy sports lose. Is that really surprising? Maybe, maybe not. But the game is rigged against you. You're playing against thousands of other lineups, not to mention experts who have more tools and more time. You don't stand a chance, quite frankly. I know I don't. But you can now have that advantage potentially if you go over and use Stat Hero. It's the first ever daily fantasy sports book that puts the player in control and winning within reach. Here's how it works. Stat Hero shows you their lineups and dares you to beat them. It's you versus the house in a head-to-head fantasy matchup. You name the stakes, winner take all. You have the advantage. Stat Hero is showing you their lineup ahead of time, and no one else does that. This is why I know, because sometimes I think that I've set my perfect lineup on a daily fantasy space, and then all of a sudden I come out and find out hours later that somebody else beat me to the punch, i.e. the experts. So you want to get over there where you have control. Stat Hero is DFS the way it was meant to be, one-on-one. Play Stat Hero now and change the odds. Go to stathero.com/lockedon, sign up for free, and right now you can get 3 times back on your first play. They're giving you 300% match. That's unheard of, my friends. Go to stathero.com/lockedon, stathero.com/lockedon. So you mentioned there the evolution of DeAndre Jordan in his time with the Brooklyn Nets. Go back to when we started out, right? Just the initial bring in, and we associated him as being, well, this is a guy that's satisfying the stars and making sure that they're happy and they want to be a part of this team in Brooklyn. But even if it's just regular season based, I think he did show that he was more than just the buddy that got brought in, because at the time when you looked at the roster, he represented a very important piece to the starting lineup in Brooklyn, even if that ended up changing over the course of 2+ seasons.
Yeah, and remember too, there was heated debates around when he first came about whether or not, who should be the starter, he or Jared Allen. This went on for basically a whole season when there was not that much to talk about because the Nets were, hovering around 500 and they were kind of in and out of the playoff race, and then COVID kind of hit. But I mean, that whole entire season, we were having just debates with people online or on the show about who should be the starter. This is only like a year ago, basically, or year and a half ago, basically, for when this discussion was happening, because there was a big DeAndre Jordan camp among Nets fans and among brass too that wanted him to start. And if you go back sort of around that evolution, it was mostly the season. Jared Allen's mostly the starter. He's playing well at times. He's having some issues though. And the Nets team, this Kyrie's not playing. It was that totally different iteration of the Nets team where it was Dinwiddie, LeVert, Jared Allen, and then like Taurean Prince, and then Joe Harris. And so it was just a totally different version of the team. And maybe you want to say, hey, we don't have that much to talk about because they're a 500 team and they're not a championship caliber team. So it became something of a sort of lightning rod for people to talk about. And then if you remember, right when COVID hit in March, right when they had fired Kenny Atkinson, the next day, you remember Jacque Vaughn takes over and DeAndre starts.
Yeah.
Right. And it was like, oh, right. Okay. Now we know what's going on here. It's Kenny didn't want this to happen. And there was probably lots of internal pushback about who was supposed to be starting and whatever, keeping people happy. DeAndre, to his credit, never said anything about it. Like he never, I don't think he was quoted one time ever publicly saying anything about his status as starter or off the bench. He ends up starting 6 games total. He starts that first game, then COVID hits, then he tests positive. He doesn't go to the bubble, blah, 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 blah. So, but it's so funny to think about that. It's just not that long ago that it's basically a season. There's one season ago that this was a heated discussion among Nets faithful about who should, and we always said it was Jared Allen. We should be Jared Allen, but about who should be starting in that spot.
Well, and it's funny too, because you're right. And I mean, there's a couple of things. It's like in the one world, man, what would it have looked like if Jared Allen was just put immediately into that role? And how could that have impacted other pieces like a Nicholas Claxton, right? We talked about how eventually when Allen gets included in a trade to get Harden over here, you kind of say, oh, well, maybe we got to hide Nicholas Claxton. Maybe there's a world where you put him on display and you end up keeping Jared Allen. Like all these different mechanisms around the five really could have gone a lot of different ways. We mentioned Kenny Atkinson in there and about that ability or lack of willingness to do what's being asked of him behind the scenes. I think the best benefit, not even for Vaughn, but I'll say now with Steve Nash, it's like, you know what the best way, if you feel like DeAndre Jordan is not going to be the player that helps you win a championship, the best way to express that to everyone is to let him play.
Yeah.
Let him show you why, yeah, the numbers are there. And also here's all the big examples of where he becomes a liability. And I think, Kenny Atkinson probably was never going to keep his job in Brooklyn ultimately, but there is better ways to go about making your case. And I think planting your flag and saying, I know this guy was brought in to be a part of this with these superstars, but it's wrong. And I'm going to basically put myself at odds with all the superstar talent in saying this isn't true. Everybody knows it. Like everyone already knew that, I think is the point to Kenny. Like everyone knew that DeAndre wasn't going to be the answer. You have to let it play out and allow Kevin Durant, allow Kyrie Irving to say, yeah, we see it. We get it. We know that if we want to win, we're going to need to make a move here. So that's maybe just an interesting thing as far as how you approach managing these personalities. And that's, again, when Steve Nash was hired, kind of what we talked about, right? You're here to understand these players and manage what it looks like to try to coach superstars, something that Kenny was not built to do, I don't think.
And they gave him that chance this year. He started 43 games this year for the Nets, which, by the way, I saw that number. I was floored by that. I never would have guessed it was that high. I watched every Nets game this year, obviously. We both did. So it's like, it wasn't for lack of paying attention. I guess it was the way the season ended that it maybe just threw off what the reality for the rest of the season was. But when I was looking back at the stats and I saw the 43 starts, I was like, what? When? Like when did those 43? Those are the 43 games that I took off from watching the Nets, because I just couldn't remember a world where it happened. But it's really funny because they basically did what you just said, which was, hey, if we want to show that this is not going to work, let's start from 43 games and we'll kind of see over the course of the season that this is just not going to be the plan, right? This is not going to work. And eventually they bring in Blake and Aldridge too. Really, Aldridge was the one that was going to switch it. And then because he was going to be the starting center, and then Blake was going to come in off the bench originally. But then when LMA had to leave because of the heart issue, then they switched that back to Blake. So it's all stuff you should go back and replay it all. And you remember it's like this crazy, lots of different stuff happen. But so you're totally right. They use those 57 games total, 43 starts to say, hey, this isn't going to work. Like it's not bringing anything to the table that we need right now. And at the end of the season, they obviously just shut the faucet off, and he was totally buried. And he didn't play the last few games of the regular season, didn't play at all, didn't register a single minute in the playoffs. So it was, in the end, Atkinson clearly was proven right about this. But,
I'm sure he'd be happy to hear now, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Like that.
Tip of the hat to you, sir. You had it.
Yeah, like that, and $1 will get you a cup of coffee at like Wawa or something like that. So it's not like it was not like you get anything for it. But Kenny
walks in. Sorry, Kenny walks in and goes, I correctly predicted that DeAndre Jordan was not going to be the answer to 5. You know,
told you. He just calls it.
Here's a McMuffin. Enjoy your day.
So yeah, no, it's just wild thing where you can sort of lose yourself in how long these seasons end up being and all the things that end up happening, because just looking back, just sort of the tail of the tape, it's just easy to forget how much happened with this guy in just two seasons, and not even 2 full seasons, because he didn't even play the second half of the season after COVID, because he never went down to the bubble. And then at the end of the season, where he just became just a sort of useless piece at the end of the bench that they weren't going to use anymore. It really is crazy to go back and think about sort of the arc that he went through on this team, from big signing. Obviously, the 2 other guys give a discount, take money off the table for themselves to get money onto the cap for DeAndre Jordan. They do him a huge solid. All this conversation about Jared Allen and blah, 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 and then go into this season. And like I said, didn't even realize he'd started this many games, which I'm still kind of thinking it's a misprint, but I guess it's not. And and now here we are, where they have to throw out tons of money and a bunch of whatever second rounders, who cares? But a bunch of second round picks just to have him be off the team anymore. It's like life comes at you fast in the NBA. It's it's pretty crazy. All right, I want to talk a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit more about what happens a little bit with the roster. Like I said, we're going to save the Millsap and stuff and LaMarcus Aldridge stuff for next episode, because we don't want to just kind of fly through that at the end here. Before we get to that, though, I got to talk to you about our friends over at Rock Auto. I've been using Rock Auto. You would think I've talked about Rock Auto, you would think I'm just constantly just doing things wrong to my car just so I can go over to Rock Auto. That's not the case. It just happens that Rock Auto is very helpful when things do happen to your car, and you don't want to go into those local places that are they're just going to type it into the computer themselves. They're going to type in the make and the model, which you just go over and do at Rock Auto. They're just going to look at their computer, which you're just doing it on your own computer, and they're just going to walk to the back and grab it. Let Rock Auto do it, because it's going to be cheaper. And then anything you're going to get at the local place, forget about the mechanic too. Oh my gosh, they're going to run you up on the price just because they can. Not at Rock Auto. Family-owned business serving do-it-yourselfers for more than 20 years. The prices are reliably low for every single customer. They have everything you need: brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, new carpets, everything you need for that car. Go to rockauto.com right now. See all the parts that are available for your car or truck, and write "Locked On" in the "How did you hear about us" box, so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com.
So one thing I did want to throw in here, just at the tail end of that DeAndre piece too, I think something that plays itself out of the course of last season as well. We mentioned Alize Johnson, not long for the roster, but remember when you're using Bruce Brown completely out of position? Like, I think part of the display is, hey, you know how you look at DeAndre Jordan and say, well, he's a rebounding monster. Look at what we're able to manufacture in that way as well. And then you get to kind of hone in on some of those defensive deficiencies and offensive deficiencies, really just deficiencies of DeAndre's game beyond the rebounding, right? Like, I think that had to have been, you mentioned the 43 starts, a part of that process of saying, yeah, he's playing all these games, but like, look at what, again, Bruce Brown is such a prime example. When we finally ran out of it, like, we were better off with an undersized Bruce Brown pseudo fiving mixed in with Blake Griffin in order to then be a more balanced team on both ends of the floor. And you have to be able to see that and say, right. And this is what we said at the time when they brought him in. The numbers are misleading with DeAndre. The double doubles, yes, it looks sexy in a stat line, but it's not reality. It's not the real impact that he has on a game, as a lot of other players that put up those type of numbers actually do make a difference to wins and losses.
And frankly, it's some of it's system for the Nets. So I'm going to forgive him a little bit here, especially when you add a guy like Harden, who is a really good rebounding guard, and you actually want him to be getting rebounds because you want him to start with the ball in his hands rather than have to make an extra play. So I'll forgive the rebounding a little bit, but the numbers were still kind of dropping off for him. His numbers this year, his per minute rebounding numbers this year were the worst of his career. So it wasn't just like he was playing fewer minutes. It was, he played the same amount of minutes as the season before and had 2.5 fewer rebounds per game. And so, again, I understand it a little bit as a system. Durant's a good rebounder too. You want those guys to be your primary rebounders because it just makes more sense for kickstarting your offense to not have to make an extra play. And the numbers were still kind of dropping down. And if you're not even going to be doing that, then clearly what the Nets were saying to themselves too is, here, if you're not going to be doing this either, and you're a huge liability on the defensive end, especially when it comes to switching, then there's and it's $10 million a year. There's just not a place for it anymore. And then, by the way, this wasn't new. They showed us at the end of the last season. We knew this. Yeah. We knew this to be the case. This was the worst kept secret in the world. That I still somehow misevaluated, but that where he was going to go. So, hey, look, like I said before, he never said a word about it. He was, by all accounts, an amazing teammate. We saw his relationship with Jared Allen, at least on the sidelines before games. He never said anything about it in the press. It's the guy, DeAndre Jordan, kind of sucks to see him go. In terms of roster construction, it was an obvious move about how the Nets want to play going forward, to be able to just have other shots for more for personnel that are going to fit in better on the team. Obviously, it works out well. So I didn't want this to come in like I was dragging DeAndre the person. He was, like I said, by all accounts, awesome. You want to talk about what they got back here really quick with the Okafor secret, please? What are your thoughts here? I mean, like I said, I think Okafor is probably cut just because I just don't know what they would do with him. But do you think, because they're going to be over the number here on available roster spots, do you think Zamboya, they keep him here, or what are your thoughts? What are your sort of just trigger thoughts here on what the maybe how the rest of the roster shakes out around the lower end of the bench, because that's where clearly he's going to be.
Yeah, and this is where, like, if you look at the age, right? I mean, we see the Nets are getting older, and we're going to get into that on the next episode with some of the other players that are now a part of this team. They are getting more and more veteran laden and preparing for that championship run. But it's like when you look at the draft, you got Cam Thomas. You think about big picture, you're trying to also maybe just restock some of the young talent. So that's what Demboya is, right? Like, he is this young talent that if you could keep him around, you probably wouldn't hate it and see how he develops. Maybe he becomes something that you can move off on later and get something back for, as Sean Marks is known to do. In the back end of the roster, I think the question becomes who would get bumped for him, right? Is it you just got Carter back in the trade with the Suns? Where does he now stack that you brought in Patty Mills? And you think that we were talking about this before we got on, that Bruce Brown can get more into a normal guard role for himself going forward for the Nets. So you've got a crowded backcourt there. You brought in, guys like Bembry is now in there. How important or not important is he? And I think in the same way that we talk about what DeAndre Jordan's value was over the course of his time, that's what you're looking at with any of these players. In the short term, let's say Bembry. Is it more important to keep Bembry or Carter? Is it more important to keep one of those players on this roster right now for winning a championship? If it is, then the young player maybe suffers and you get something back for him and he gets moved or cut, whatever it may be. But if you think that all of these guys are kind of low-level value for your championship, then I hang on to who you think has the best big picture long-term value, and that might be one of the younger guys to me.
Yeah, this is going to be a tough one. I'm not really sure. I mean, obviously, the funny joke here is that the Nets keep getting these young guys from the Pistons and then turning them into really the value just skyrockets the second they leave the Pistons. They did it with Dinwiddie, who had been in their G League, and then on the team they did it with Bruce Brown, obviously. Those are the young guys. They did it with Blake, obviously, too. And that's a little different though, because the Pistons were doing the same thing with it that the Nets were doing with DeAndre. It was like, it's not Blake the guy, it's Blake the money. And when you don't have to pay him that kind of money, it becomes a different talking point. But that's the part where I want Demboya to stick with the team and become awesome, because it would just be great to have another version of this story playing out where the Pistons just can't wait to get rid of a guy and then the Nets turn him into something way, way more valuable. I'm not sure that's going to be there. I will say the draft pedigree on him is higher than those other two guys. He was a first-round pick, top 15 pick just 2 seasons ago. That was part of the old Detroit regime where they have switched over to a new GM. And so sometimes that the guys that were part of the previous drafts just aren't lining up with who maybe they would have taken. Doesn't mean you have
my
to.
Guy, right? It's not my guy, right?
Right. And by the way, you could be good enough where it doesn't matter whose guy you were, but they just clearly didn't see Demboya as being that place. He had kind of gotten buried last season with some of these other young guys, and there was going to be not maybe the path for development for him that they were going to need to see. But like I said, there was a world where only 2 years ago this guy was a high draft pick, recognizing that draft was pretty weak, right? So, so I don't know. I think the Nets end up keeping him. It's so hard to tell because you mentioned Bembry. There's a world where that can kind of work. I was never really that excited about that signing to begin with. I don't think we even ever talked about it on the podcast in any meaningful way. But that one didn't really excite me. I did watch him play a decent amount in Toronto last year. It's just, I don't know. I wasn't totally seeing it, but maybe the Nets he was going to have a slightly different role. In the world where the team is crazy old at this point around the rotation guys, having a younger guy or two wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. So maybe that's where he sticks, but it's kind of hard to tell right now because they are in a numbers crunch here.
Yeah, well, you think about last season, right? Injuries come up and you don't want to expect them, but you do want to be ready for them just in case. It's why Alize Johnson goes off for a handful of games, right? Like, you're going to need some bodies to get out there and run for you. And if we'll get into this over the course of the offseason. Where's say Nicholas Claxton now fitting in this spectrum of players? All of a sudden, he becomes a young guy that's still on the team, but isn't nearly going to be looked at, I don't think, the way that he was last year, or the way that we thought he was projecting on this roster. So now all of a sudden, he's a young talent that you know and you like, and also this is off the cuff here, but remember, he's eligible for an extension. Like, he's coming up to earn a paycheck, not dissimilar in the way that Jared Allen was coming up to earn a paycheck, and all of a sudden, we may be looking at opportunities for the Nets to shuffle the deck here a little bit. So you maybe have to open up beyond the veterans and the guys we know are a part of this championship run. Everybody else might be very much movable and tradable, and you can start to restack the coffers as far as the assets you gave away to move off the DeAndre contract. So we got a ways to go here before I think we get a real clear picture around what this roster looks like heading into the season.
Yeah, that's on the notes for this week. It's one of the things we have to talk about, because as soon after we're done rolling through some of these additions, next episode, obviously we already said we're going to talk about Millsap and LaMarcus Aldridge sort of together, but the flip side of, the cascading effect of these guys, because you would there's one world we would say, hey, we moved off the DeAndre Jordan. Nick Claxton now has a clear path for development, right? Like, not like DJ was necessarily standing in his way before, but you can't play them together and all this other stuff. And so we're kind of like, okay, they need size, and Nets need size. This is where Claxton's really to come and shine. And now 48 hours later, it's like, was Claxton going to play? He might not play. We're in a really, really weird situation with their front court. They went from really kind of we were sort of sweating out the piece where are they going to have enough front court depth, to the point where now it's like we're going to have a real conversation later about whether Nick Claxton sees the light of day during the season, because that's just sort of how the roster is shaping up. Like I said, we'll be back again tomorrow talking more about the Millsap signing, talking more about the eventuality that LaMarcus Aldridge is going to sign as well. We're going to have you covered all throughout this week. Make sure that you're listening also to Locked. Betting doesn't have to be a guessing game. If you listen to the new Locked On Bets podcast, hosted by your boy Q and handicapping expert Lee Sterling, daily picks, blowout specials, wrong team favorite picks, locks of the day. Follow Locked On Bets podcast, brought to you by betonline.ag, wherever you get podcasts. You help our podcast out by liking and subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. The aforementioned YouTube, head on over to the new YouTube channel. We'll be posting podcasts over there as well every day if you want to take a look at our fine looking mugs. The link for YouTube will be in the show notes here. Buddy, send us out with something good.
Well, as we do go live in front of the camera now, it's worth mentioning I'm a little bit naked, but that's okay. Lady Gaga.
What are the all-time? I don't know, Mike. Every time the name gets changed a little bit, I think that's going to get me from now till infinity. All right, we'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.